Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Sayville Library and the Community Outreach Department at Sayville Library, my name is Jonathan Pryor. I'm the Department Head of Community Outreach, and it is my privilege to welcome you this evening to another in our community interview series that we have here at the library. The community interview series is the idea of our library director, Jennifer Fowler, and she came up with this idea speaking with Dr. Bertsch, our host this evening. And Jennifer's idea was to, during the height of the pandemic closures, that a great way to bring our community together and to encourage it would be to interview prominent citizens in our town that have made a significant contribution to our way of life together. And we can think of no one else who has made significant contributions to our way of life here in Sayville and in our greater town than Chris Bodkin, who is our interviewee this evening. We are very privileged to have Chris Bodkin with us. Happy to have him here at the library on our premises interviewing this evening. So without further delay, I'd like to turn the interview over to Dr. Bertsch and to Chris Bodkin. Welcome, everyone. Just as a side note, we will keep you muted for the beginning portion of our interview, and that just helps cut down on some of the background noise that we might experience from having so many people on Zoom. Once we move to our Q&A portion of our interview, we will allow you to unmute and ask any questions that you may have. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our community interview with Dr. James Bertsch and our privileged guest this evening, Chris Bodkin.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. And before I go any further, the first person I want to thank is Tom Travis for recommending that I find a good quartet song for Chris Bodkin, because Chris really, I wanted to make you feel comfortable, and Tom was the Johnny on the spot recommending an appropriate musical choice. So thank you. But I also want to thank everybody that's here for spending your time sharing as a community. And I do see Linda Holliday, a board member on the library. Thank you, Linda, for your support in making our library such a vibrant part of our community. The genesis for these series of interviews, Mark Casabiri approached me and said, James, and I'm sure a lot of you remember when we experienced a bunch of arsons in the late 80s in Sayville, and the community was devastated. And Chris said, we've got to do something to bring the community together. I kicked myself for decades that we weren't doing something. So one of the things that came out of that conversation was I reached out to Jen, and Jen said, well, why not do some interviews of some really important, noteworthy people in Sayville? And since that time, Jonathan, I don't know if we've done 10 or 12 different community interviews. And I'm just really honored that Chris would spend time with us tonight. And Chris Bodkin, he's up here, and Chris is entering the new world of Zoom with the rest of us. Chris was a town council member, also the deputy supervisor for the town of Islip. And what I think about is I feel that, that kind of voice that really cares about a local community and cares about nurturing the bonds that really make life worth living. That was Chris. That's who Chris was in his public service. And I think there's been some lasting impacts. I don't want to say them all up front because they're going to come out in our questions. But I really, and Chris, I'm not just saying this, I don't know of a person that I've heard of that has had as big an impact on the greater Sayville area as you. And I mean that sincerely. So welcome, Chris. Thank you for spending the time. And to reiterate what Jonathan said, we have the microphones are muted for everybody. There is a chat feature if you want to put chats in during the conversation. But we always save a lot of time at the end for people to just speak freely and ask questions of their own of Chris. So I definitely welcome you to use that chat. And towards the end, please stick around because that's really such a fun part of the conversation is when you get to ask your own questions. So Chris, welcome. Thank you very much. And I did want to start with, for me, it's a part of our shared history. I worked on the Sayville ferries as a kid. And I know the Bay is an important part of your life, always has been since you're young and now. But I wanted to kind of start with that. Can you talk about some of the different jobs you've had on the Great South Bay, I know you worked in Weston's Boatyard when you were young, but you also were a captain for the ferries. So can you talk a little bit about some of your experiences working on the bay and about the bay in general for our community?
Well, I was always, like many people here, fascinated by the bay. And when I was in 7th grade, I rode my bicycle down to Doug Weston's boatyard and asked them if they needed help. And to my amazement, they said yes. I was just a little skinny kid on a bike. What could I do? Well, what I did was every day after school, I rode my bike down, and my job was two things: sweep up all the sawdust and put all the tools away from the work that was going on during the day. But it was the wonderful world of wooden boats. Back then, all boats were still wood. The first fiberglass boat that I know of ever was the yard boat for Doug Weston's boatyard. It was called the Smug. It was built in 1945 or 46 out of fiberglass and was something new in the world. For a million years, people made boats out of wood, but along came fiberglass. Anyway, so my job was to sweep up the sawdust, which was ankle deep by the end of the day. They made boats. They made thistles and blue jays and masts and booms. Every kind of equipment and machinery was running away. It also had a railway.
Wow.
Before power lifts, there was railroad tracks that went into the river and boats were yanked out. And the way it worked, it was a real sight to behold. Jimmy March, who was the head boat builder and who really ran the yard, had a sketch on a card of every boat in the bay, just about. And when somebody came in to get their boat hauled out, he would look it up in his card catalog of boats and look at the keel and then check the tide. For some reason, Boston tide, Boston high water and Boston low water is the same exact tide for Sayville. So we always had a Boston calendar, tide calendar on the wall. And he would tell whoever it was, Mr. Jones, bring your boat around at 3 p.m. on Friday, the 12th. It'll be just right tide. Pardon me, just the right tide to haul your boat out. And we would back a cradle into the river. The boat would come over it. It'd start up this motor and crank the boat out of the water. And then there was the turntable, and you could turn it into whichever barn you wanted to put the boat into. I mean, it was heaven for a kid, for a skinny kid on a bike. I was just fascinated. And it was a joy for me to work there and contribute in some small way to a great tradition.
Well, you worked on the bay for a long time too. Didn't you go on to progress to become a ferry captain? And so what
Moved upriver and became a deckhand on the Cherry Grove Ferry. And did that because I was still in high school. And back then, you had to be at least 18 to get your captain's license, which was a lot of work, a lot of study, and you had to amass a great number of hours, 100 hours, to be even eligible to take the exam. But anyway, I was a deckhand, and that was wonderful. I think back to how blessed I was to live in a community where there were all these opportunities for a little boy on a bike, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I did 2 or 3 years as a deckhand and got my captain's license and ran ferry boats for many, many years.
What years were you running ferries, Chris?
Oh,
About
I guess it would have to been from the early 70s, late 60s, right up until a few years ago. The last
Ooh.
ferry, I ran ferries for 30 years, I guess,
Well-
30, 35 years. And all that time, I never once bent a prop. I never ran aground. And it was quite an accomplishment not to run aground.
In the bay? Yeah,
On the Fire Island side of the bay, it's pretty shallow.
yeah.
And you got to know your stuff or be very cautious. Many people did bend props over at the beach, and it's costly and disruptive of the ferry schedules and so forth, and even private boats. But back then, before radar, we would run a ferry with course and time. So you would do 5 knots for 5 minutes at one compass reading and come right up on a buoy by doing that. It was quite a skill.
Yeah.
It really was. When radar came in, of course, radar changed everything and made it much easier, really. But before, as I was working on the ferries, I also worked in the city for McAllister Brothers and Moran, the tugboat companies. Not on the boats, I worked on the corporate end of it. Moran had an office in the World Trade Center, and McAllister had their office at 17 Battery Place. And I commuted every day and worked in ships and tugboats. I can't tell you how blessed I was to have a job that got me out onto the harbor now and then.
Yeah.
And not sitting behind a desk.
Let me ask you a question. In terms of the bay, how do you think life has changed, but also maybe remain the same on the Great South Bay?
Well, I know for sure there's far less pleasure boating than there was. There was a time when sailboats were in their heyday. This would have been in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, where on a Saturday afternoon in the summer, there'd be hundreds of sailboats out on the bay. Wet Pants, the yacht clubs, all those organizations had regattas and competitions of every sort. And there were many, many more pleasure boats. When you go down now on a Saturday, it's hard to see any boats. It's just a different world. I can't explain it. I'm kind of befuddled by it, to tell you the truth, because sailboating is so much fun and so rewarding. And yet, I guess technology and other opportunities have changed the world.
My children did Wet Pants, and they're 13 and 15. So this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And their experiences, Wet Pants at the time, we had unprecedented enrollment in the sailing school. Like, I think the kids, they had a kind of a broad approach. Wherever the kids were, skill-wise, they were welcome. So there's definitely life out there. But I know exactly what you mean, Chris. It's definitely tapered out a lot in terms of the bay. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was, and Chris has done interviews, and Chris, you had mentioned before, you're on the board of the Suffolk County Historical Society, but I've watched some of Chris's other interviews that were really focusing on local history. And Chris, you used a term which I really loved, and it just kind of resonated with me. You referred to Sable as Appledore. I kind of wanted to ask you to what that means, and maybe describe a few memories that help illustrate what you mean by Sable being Appledore.
Well, from Oakdale to Blue Point is really one community. And I know that just from knocking on doors for political campaigns. All my political campaigns for town board and so forth were knocking doors, door to door. I must have walked 1,000 miles. But Appledore, I noticed that almost every house had an apple tree. Everybody has apple trees. Everywhere I went, there would, I love trees. I love looking at them and wondering what they are, what the names are and so forth. But there are so many, a million apple trees from Oakdale to Blue Point. But the center community in that neighborhood of Oakdale to Blue Point is Sayville. It's where people come. It's where there's retail and restaurants that attract people from other corners. One day I was driving by in England on vacation. There was a little town called Appledore in the south of England. And it sounds like something out of The Hobbit. But I said Appledore, that's what, I live in Appledore. I live in West Sayville, and I have a couple of apple trees. So I really, just in my mind, it was a pleasant name for a very, very pleasant community. Appledore itself, but Sayville really is the center of it. And we're blessed to have a town like Sayville, blessed to have been grown up in a wonderful little place that even after all these years, I'm 73 now, still is a wonderful, wonderful place to bring up children and enjoy life in this great country of ours. So anyway, it's Appledore.
Thank you. It's funny. I think the charm, the Victorian charm, I was with a group once, we were talking about, well, what would Sayville of the future look like? And no one agreed on anything except one thing. They all loved our Victorian looking town. And they were like, we don't need modern architecture in Sayville. Like, it was like the one point that everybody could agree on.
We have a wonderful, bustling Main Street. And we owe a lot to the merchants who hang in there through tough times and keep it going. We have a long history of great shops and stores and restaurants. It's the reason people come to Sayville and enjoy themselves. So
we spend it's funny, I once spoke to Eileen Tisner, who mentioned they spend their advertising dollars for Summerfest in Nassau because people want to walk back in time and come here, because we preserve the charm in ways that a lot of communities haven't been able to do. And it's on this topic is our next question is, you've spoken about exotic foods because you grew up here. You've spoken about very exotic foods coming to Sayville. And, I the two restaurants that you mentioned in a prior interview, which I just love the story. You spoke about when Sayville pizza, we had pizza in Sayville and Wawa. It's kind of a watershed in Sayville's history. So can you discuss and maybe kind of tell us a story about when Sayville pizza came to Sayville, this exotic food?
it was a community where people grew up on meat and potatoes. I lived in a big old house in South Sayville, and my mom was a great cook, but every meal was meat and potatoes. If we had a spice rack, there would be two things on it, salt and pepper. That was the extent of spices. One day, word got out that there was a pizza shop opening, Sayville Pizza. Nobody knew what the hell it was. We all rode our bikes up to look at it. You could buy a slice of pizza for 15 cents and a Coke was a dime. So for 25 cents, you got a slice and a Coke. But I remember distinctly a whole bunch of us standing around looking at this pizza, kind of poking it, wondering what it could be. But it was wonderful. And then right after that, I guess when Nixon went to China is when Wawa Kitchen opened up right about the same time. China was much in the news. And that was another, we had never seen Chinese food anywhere around. Even the restaurants were meat and potatoes. I guess we were boring in that respect. But those two places are still there after all these years. And they're still providing good service to the community. But the pizza was the really funny one, with everybody crowded around looking at it like it just came from Mars.
So funny. Such a different time.
Yeah, it was. Even the dogs were barking at it.
You know, you mentioned your first adult job before, Chris. You mentioned that, you know, you worked in the World Trade Center, but your job moved to Connecticut, but you wouldn't leave Sable. And instead you kind of moved into politics. So, you know, walk you through that decision to remain here, and you devoted your life to your community. So, you know, tell us a little bit about that decision, and I kind of have a follow-up on that, where you decided to enter politics and you weren't going to leave Sable. So what were you thinking at the time?
Well, Moran moved the headquarters, corporate headquarters, from the Trade Center to Greenwich, Connecticut. And they would pay for me to move up there. And I just thought about it for about a minute and said there was no way I could leave lifelong friends and family in this wonderful town and move to Connecticut, to where I knew nobody and nobody knew me. And I mean, people do it every day, but I was determined to stay in a place that I really loved and wanted to spend the rest of my life, wanted my children to go to school here. So I stayed, and we drove to Connecticut. There was two other men. One lived in Central Islip and another in Flushing. And we would pick them up, and three of us would drive to Connecticut every day. Well, I did that for about 2 years, and that was it. I couldn't take it. It was 2 or 3 hours each way. So I left that job and worked full time that summer on the ferries and made ends meet then. And then I heard they were looking for somebody at town hall who could do correspondence. And I can write a pretty good letter. I got the job with Frank Jones, who was the supervisor then. Frank Jones was a great human being, a real wonderful supervisor and resident of Sable. He lived on Candy Avenue. We have a long history of supervisors that came from Sable. Peter Cohallen, too, another great administrator and supervisor in the town of Islip. So I got hired at town hall and really loved it. It was really, local government was my baby. It was, not only could you do a lot of things, help people in basic ways, but it was fun. It was great fun. Planting trees and improving drainage. May not get you on the road to the White House, but it was did a lot of good for a lot of people. And it was fun all along the way.
So how did you go from being someone that was helping with correspondence to a town council member?
Well, I wrote speeches too. And Frank recognized the speeches as something he liked. So I turned into a speechwriter too. And from that, I guess my hustle and coming up with ideas of things that needed to be done, which I knew needed to be done because I lived here. And I was blessed with imagination and curiosity, I think, which led me to read a great deal. I'd like to say a word about libraries, because the Save a Library for me was a wonderful refuge. When I was a little skinny kid on that bike, I would frequently go to the library when it was over on Collins Avenue and grab a couple of encyclopedias and an atlas and just spend the afternoon poring over the pages of those volumes. There's nothing like a good library in a community. It really isn't. Communities that don't have libraries, and there are many of them in this country, are really communities that are a great hindrance in their getting their people along in life.
Yeah, I
Been
agree.
so blessed here with the Save a Library, with good people working in it and just clean, well-lit place to go to.
It's a community builder. And I think that's what I like about it. So like Bayport recently, they bought the convent to make a new library. And to me, I'm excited because I think you need that glue to help people feel grounded and to feel connected. It's how you ward off isolation and experience the joy of living together. But one thing you did, Chris, that I think it's of particular importance to me. Mike Dozdiak is a political consultant, past president of the Sable Rotary. He shared a story that I didn't know about until recently, Chris. That the town had passed, I believe through a referendum, through a vote, term limits on town of Islip council members. And somebody, I believe it was a supervisor, wanted to kind of do away with that. You stood with the people since they had voted and kind of bucked your political party. And you faced some consequences that you had to run in a primary that you won, and you won the election. So, can you talk a little bit about that decision when, you said, no, like term limits are important, and you stood by that, even when you faced criticism. So tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, Peter McGowan has term limits imposed on him by a townwide municipal referendum. It wasn't an action of the town board. It was the vote of the people that there would be term limits. And he wanted to undo it. And he wouldn't undo it without everybody on the board voting to undo the term limits. And because it was the voice of the people, a townwide vote, I wouldn't have anything to do with interfering with what the people voted for, the purest form of democracy. And so he made sure the party didn't give me the nomination to run again for office. So I had to mount a primary, and doing a primary is kind of like boot camp. You only want to do that once. You never want to do something like that twice. It's an enormous amount of work. It's up at 6 every morning and back in bed by midnight every day for weeks and weeks, months. Anyway, I won the primary, and then went on to win the election. But the next time I ran, they weren't going to give me the nomination again to punish me. And so I switched parties and lost that election. But I did 20 good years there. And
Chris, I brought that story up because I think that kind of political courage, it's like we're in a desert, and political courage is the water, and there isn't enough. So I just wanted to kind of underscore that story because I think what you said just now really struck me as the purest form of democracy, and that mattered to you, and you stuck with it. I just think, to me, when I heard that, I was very inspired. So I just wanted to thank you.
Well, thank you. It was a tough time for me,
I'm
but
sure.
I could sleep at night knowing I did the right thing. And I think the town is better off for it, so.
It's definitely better. I've been following town politics in the last, 8 or 9 years, and I'm grateful that you kept the term limits. And I think this kind of flows into the next question. Civility and respect. Those are two words everyone who knows you would use to describe you. You've done something for three veterans that I think are vital. And those veterans are Carl Johnson, Florence Evans, and Merrill Mason. Tell us a little bit about who they are and what led you to honor them. And is that part of your life's work that still really means a lot to you?
Well, I really enjoy history, and World War II was just an incredible time. Not that long ago, really. But I stumbled on when I was first with the town, the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor was coming up. And a town worker from Sayville named Tom Green, who was he passed away long ago, called my attention to the fact that we had somebody from Sayville who was killed at Pearl Harbor, which I had never heard of. His name was Carl Johnson, and they named Johnson Avenue after him. And then I just got to thinking about who was Carl Johnson. It took a lot of digging to find his family and learn about his life. But he was a kid who just worked for the Posy Wang machine shop on Lakeland Avenue as a high school kid, like I worked at Doug Weston's. And back then, it was the Depression, and there was real poverty throughout Long Island, as there was throughout the country. So when you turned 18 in many households, you had to get out, you had to move on in life, whether you had a job or not. And Carl joined the Army. And because he worked in a machine shop and had a good sense of mechanics, he ended up as an airplane mechanic and ended up in Hawaii. And on that fateful morning, to show you how different the world was, the enlisted men, the mechanics, could fly the planes on Sunday.
Wow.
So they could get some hours and get their license and maybe improve their rank and so forth. And Carl was pushing a training plane out of the hangar at Hickam Field, right next to Pearl Harbor, about 8 o'clock in the morning. He was going to take it up. And the Japanese came right over the cliff. The first thing the Japanese wanted to accomplish was to shoot all the planes on the ground so they couldn't get up and go after them. So they went right down, right above the ground, and poor Carl Johnson never knew what hit him. And died right on the spot. And then in doing more and more research on World War II, I discovered that Florence Evans, another person who really had been forgotten about, was a nurse. And to my knowledge, the only woman combat fatality from all of Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk. And she was killed on the last day of the war in Europe. So we have a man and a woman. One died on the first day of the war, and one died on the last day of the war. One died in the Pacific, and one died in the Atlantic, Europe. And I don't think there's another country and another town in the world that had that happen. And they knew each other because Sayville was a very small town in the 1930s and 40s. But so anyway, I thought that everything should be done to recognize the two of them. And there's no other way of doing it than to put a monument someplace so people can come and read the inscriptions on the monument. It was quite an undertaking to get 2 boulders. They weigh about 5 tons.
Did you do those both around the same time? Were they done, like one of them, Florence Evans is, her monument is behind Crickets.
Right.
Carl Johnson's at the end of Johnson Avenue. Did you do those around the same time?
Well, they were done within a few years of each other.
Gotcha.
The town commissioner of Public Works was a man named John Petito, who fought in World War II.
Hmm.
And he understood well what we were going to accomplish. And we were able to get a big front loader at the Blydenburg dump. The glacier, the great glacier that formed Long Island, stopped halfway down the middle of the island. And where it stopped, you can see when you drive to Stony Brook, for example, all of a sudden there's hills and dales and boulders that we don't have here in the South Shore.
Right.
We were the outwash plain. But in the Blydenburg landfill, there were boulders that rode the front of the glacier down 10,000 years ago.
Hmm.
We were able to pick up the boulders and put them on flatbed truck and move them down to Sayville and bring the front loaders down and put them into place. It was quite an undertaking.
Yeah.
But the good thing is that they're there forever. They're not going anywhere. And the inscriptions are cut into them. And I see people to this day, I'll catch people reading the inscription and thereby remembering Carl Johnson and Florence Evans and their sacrifice. Florence Evans was a wonderful, hardworking nurse. Back then, you stayed in the service until the end of the war for the duration. And Florence was a frontline nurse who saw the worst of the action. She was under fire many times. She really went through a hell of a lot in the service of her country. And Carl and the other veterans were really forgotten about. When I looked in the book of those who gave their lives, Sayville has many, many people in
Yeah.
World War I, World War II.
You do.
People who left town one day to join the Army or the Navy and never came back. And I did everything I could to remember them by. And Merrill Mason was a good buddy of mine. And we were contemporaries in high school. In back of his house on Hampton Street was an island, a complete separate island at the top of Browns River, which had no name. And I was just trying to think of some way we could remember Merrill by. And it came to me that the island had no name. So I went to the county who oversees such things as that and asked them if they would, Bob Gaffney was the county executive then. And they put a resolution before the county legislature to name the island Captain Merrill Mason Island.
Awesome.
So it appears on all the official maps of the United States forevermore as a way of remembering Merrill, who died in the last weeks of the Vietnam War. He was shot down and killed.
And there's 3 memorials are throughout Sayville. So, you know, and I'll ask you to go a little bit off script here a little bit, Chris, but like, why do you think and I have very strong feelings. Why are such monuments so important, and why were they so important to you, especially now where we appear to be losing our respect?
Yeah, I think it's important that we never ever forget. And that's a theme that runs through monuments and cemeteries, and Americans are somewhat guilty of not knowing their own history. Many Americans can't figure what years wars took place. So they think World War II was in 1890, and the Civil War was in 1700. There's nothing like a monument that can't be moved in any way, shape, or form to do the best you can so that never forgotten. On Sparrow Park, we added all the names of all the Vietnam and Korean War soldiers who were also all from Sayville, who had really been forgotten. There's nothing worse than going off and dying for your country and then being forgotten.
Mm.
And so whatever I could do, whenever I could do it, I would have something named. Mike Gibbons died in Vietnam. He was a great guy. So I was able to have a street named after him
Yep.
up on Lakeland Avenue when they put the new Fairfield apartments in.
I kind of figured, Chris, that you were responsible for that. But I'm familiar with his history, but I'm glad that I was hoping that Gibbons was named after him, and I'm glad you said that, because that's new to me. I didn't know that.
Any chance I got to remember a combat fatality, I did it. Many others too. So anyway, it was the right thing to do. And I'm glad I worked hard to get as many names out there as I could for people, not only who served, but who served and died.
Well, and this is another testament to your hard work. It's Bayman Soccer Field. Now, I think most people know about Bayman Soccer Field. And this is our last question, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience after this. But Bayman Soccer Field, for those of you not familiar, it's at the end of Cherry Street. It's a pretty storied piece of land, but it wasn't always a soccer field, and there were alternative plans at one point for that property. And for anybody that lives here knows, there's like thousands of children have played on that soccer field, and it's a real focal point for our community. So tell us a little bit about your role in helping that land become a soccer field. Tell us what happened and what you did to make it happen.
Well, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, owned the property. And as Connie could tell you, there was quite a radio station there that went back to 1910 or even before, at the beginning of the age of radio. And they wanted to divest themselves of the property. So to make a long story short, the federal government was going to turn it over to the highest bidder. And it was rumored they were going to build apartments there. The Weather Bureau came along and wanted to build an X-ray radar tower there. And the neighbors rose up because there was fear the radar beam would be bad for everybody's health in the neighborhood. So that got run out of town, and rightfully so. There was a lot of problems with a giant radar station going in the top of Cherry Avenue. Anyway, to make a long story short, the day came the FCC was going to announce the property up for public sale, and it was going to be let out for apartments of some kind. And at that time, the Bayman Soccer League was playing their soccer games in probably 10 or 15 different locations over scattered around the town. I have to give credit where credit is due because I picked up the phone and called Senator Al D'Amato, who was known as Senator Pothole back then. And I asked for his help. And I spoke to Frank Jones, who was then supervisor. And he said, don't waste your time on it. They'll never, ever give it to us, because I thought it would be a great home for the Bayman Soccer League. Anyway, long story short, Al D'Amato was wonderful. And his staff person, Pam Ray, was terrific. And they were able to get legislation put through on the refunding of the Communications Commission to keep it in the federal purview, federal park system. It's actually, even to this day, part of the National Park Service actually owns it.
Wait, so say that again, Chris, the National Park Service owns it?
Yeah, the National Park Service owns the property, and it's given over to the town, providing that it's constantly kept as a recreational use, which it is. The town then enters into a contract with the Bayman Soccer League, and we were able to preserve it as long in perpetuity, as long as it stays as a soccer field. You can go by there on a Friday afternoon or a Saturday or a Sunday in the fall, and there's 500 kids playing soccer.
An institution.
Yeah, and we owe it to, I guess, myself, Frank Jones, and Senator D'Amato and Pam Ray. It was a long haul. I had to make a couple of trips to Washington on my own dime, actually. They wouldn't pay for it, but there was a couple of people I had to see to keep it on the legislation. Go ahead.
I just think that's amazing that you, and I want to underscore that, on your own dime. So in other words, you saw an opportunity for our community, but you didn't receive the support. But again, it's the right thing to do. So you paid your own way down to Washington, D.C. with multiple trips to make that happen.
I took my old car and I never thought it would make it the second time, but it did. I had a flat once. Luckily, it was a place where I could pull over to the side of the road and change the tire and keep going. So I could make a meeting I had to be at. And anyway, in the end, all that aside, in the end, it was a very happy ending. And I'm so happy that the Bayman Soccer League does such a great job. And it's such a great place for the children of our community to play soccer, which is a wonderful game. And so it gives me a little pride to have some part in that and having made that happen.
Well, thank you. From the thousands of children and families that have benefited from it, thank you.
It's a real to go by and see it. No pun intended.
At this point, I want to turn it over to the audience. You know, a few things did come up in chat. I actually dropped out for a second. I think I need to trim my tree or something because I seem to lose my internet sometimes. So I did lose my chat. But we could also, you know, we could start from the chat. We could also take questions if people want to unmute themselves.
Okay, great. Anybody there?
I have one.
Go, Tommy.
Chris, you mentioned memorable eating establishments. I wonder if you could describe the scene at in the Sable Modern Diner at 2 a.m. after we got kicked out of Governor's Pub.
Actually, you're right, absolutely right. The Sable Modern Diner, which was something out of a movie, was just great. Was packed at closing time. the bars all closed at 2 a.m. or so, and everybody would pour out of the bars and into the diner. And back then, the short order cook was right out in the open. Today, all the diners have the cook in the back, but he would be right there. And it was really, really great fun to come. It was the second part of the evening where after the bars closed, you could go sit there in the diner with 100 other people just like you. In the same,
I'm guilty of that too, Chris.
same shape you were in.
See, Jim said, there are a few people I wanted to, that I know that we have Roy Fedlam, if you want to just wave. Roy is the president of the Sable Historical Society. We also have Hal Brown. Hal is the president of the Sable Alumni Association. So they are two compatriots in the love of local history, Chris. I just wanted to call attention to them.
Well, I'd just like to congratulate them for the work they do. Throughout this country, it's really, really key and really important that certain people rise to the occasion and do everything they can to preserve local history, because nobody else will do it if they don't do it. There's no funding from the federal level or many levels in many communities to preserve local history, and it's so important. And so many hours are put into it without a penny of compensation. Those people are real heroes, and I'm grateful for all the work they do in keeping local history going.
Thank you. Now, Jim Chant. Jim is a friend of mine. Jim's active civically as well, but Jim Chant, you had raised your hand for a question.
Well,
Go ahead,
I actually just raised my hand for the the Sable Modern Diner, but but that's what. But I sort of have a question here, and I just kind of like to hear Chris. I don't want to make this too biting, so I give a little background thing. I mean, as a kid, when you were talking about monuments and things and knowing history, my grandmother lived upstate in the foothills of the Adirondacks, and we used to walk through this cemetery to go into town, and we'd walk by all these graves from the 1918 pandemic. So, I mean, that made a burning image in my young, young mind, because I would just see whole families, and families were large back then, just wiped out, by this thing. So that was always in the background. And I guess I don't want, scapegoats naming, but Chris, from your perspective, living in Sayville for all these years, has something changed in our character? And I just want to speak to that, not people or things that has made this. Why was our response to this? Was it different? Number one, because I don't really know. But from viewing it from a spectrum from, reaction, the public health reaction to a very political thing. And has there something changed in our character as a society, or is it just, this is how people always react? You get my question? I don't want to get into names of people and responsible parties. It's just kind of very general.
The first pandemic took place almost as part of World War I.
Mm-hmm.
And there was so much death in the air. We were only in the war for 15 months, and we lost 100,000 men. People died of very common, ordinary. There was much more death, I think, in the.
There was, yes. Mm-hmm.
And right up until the invention of, the invention, I guess, of penicillin. People died regularly at a very young age. We come to expect ourselves to live in our 70s, 80s, and 90s now. And I don't know what the answer to your question is. I think it's if things are different.
Do you think we've changed? Our expectations different? That's really what, do you think, from that standpoint?
Maybe we rely more on government to help now than back then. It's a miracle what's happened in the last year with the coming up with the vaccine
Mhm.
so quickly and distributing it so quickly.
Hmm.
In 1918, they had nothing.
Right.
No, there was no vaccine. It was just, it ran its course and a lot more people died, like you said. But, okay, well, thanks. Like I said,
Hi, Chris.
Other questions? Go
Hi,
ahead.
Judy Stein.
Hi, Judy.
How are you, my darling? I love you dearly. We've always had such a joyous time at your family home, and you have done so much for the community and for Suffolk County. I mean, it's endless. I do want to ask you, do you remember the time, June 6, 1994, when you and Kenny and the Park Service put together an outing for over 150 veterans
Yeah,
of foreign war over to Sailor's Haven?
it was the 50th anniversary of D-Day.
Excellent. Judy, thank you for asking that question. I was kind of hoping you would. Chris, please tell us that story.
Well, it was the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and I felt we just had to do something. It was such a huge day in the history of Western civilization, really. But so what better to do than put all the veterans on a landing craft of some kind, which turned out to be the Fire Island Empress and Duchess, hit the beach. It was a wonderful, Kenny Stein was really, really terrific in putting it together. And the maritime end of it, the boats, it was really terrific. It was a very poignant day, and everybody walked across the island, the beach, to the surf, which was so evocative of the landing at Normandy.
Hmm.
It was a great day. And I got a lot of coverage for the vets.
Yes.
Many of them back then were World War II vets.
Yeah.
And so I had forgotten about that, Judy. Thank you.
Oh, you've done so much, Chris, so much. We love you.
But we haven't spoken about, to pat myself on the back a little, the tree program.
That's right.
In the Sayville area alone, I think we planted over 800 trees.
Yeah.
If you go up and down many, many streets, the newer, younger trees were part of that program. And that's something that's lasting, because all of the Norway oaks, no, maples,
Maple.
are all dying off, the ones that were planted after the 38 hurricane. Anyway, the long story short, we were able to plant 800 trees in this area alone.
Yeah.
Also townwide in other communities too. And that's
800. I didn't know that number.
800.
They're all grown great.
There they are.
Yes.
They were real trees. They weren't just sticks. When we put them in the ground, they had a proper ball and were planted by landscapers to make sure that they would stay. But you go up and down many streets and there they are. They're doing very well. So anyway,
Hey, Chris, is there a connection between your high school nickname and a restaurant on Main Street?
for years people thought that was my restaurant, but I was actually born in Brooklyn, and I had got the name Cricket from my brother Bill, he's 18 months older, and he couldn't say Chris, he said Quick. Quick went to Cricket somehow. So to this day, I have this ridiculous name of Cricket, which is kind of nice too. But that's how I got the name Cricket. And no relation to the restaurant.
Excellent. Thank you, Howard. I did wonder that myself too. I see Therese, that's my mom, Therese Bertsch had a question. Hold on. We can, we'll unmute
Yeah,
you.
okay, I did. Hi, Chris. I have a little history which you probably don't even know about, but my aunt worked for Dr. Fitzgerald in Queens, and when we moved out here, she told me I should see Dr. Bodkin. So George Bodkin was our doctor, and your father was our dentist. And I also know from the Lemanuels, Tom and Kathy are good friends, that they think you're wonderful. And I told them about this. They said, he would always knock on Tom's mother's, Rosie's door, just check in, see how she's doing. But I think I was listening to Jim's question, and I understand the question is a deep one. And what I heard you say was you were blessed with curiosity and an imagination. But I also see that when you were working, you had ethics, and you couldn't compromise your ethics. And I wonder, in terms of, everything today, so much today, not everything is transactional. It's just transactional. There's no process, there's no rootedness, there's no history. And I wonder, like, when you think of, I know the community has shaped you as a person. What about your family? Like, just your, being raised, and, how did they look at, working with others and ethics? And do you think those things have changed?
Well, I think I grew up in a household where books were everywhere. I think reading and curiosity and education, there's nothing like books. We used to get books for Christmas, wrapped up with bows on them. And look at this, I got The Last of the Mohegans, and we would get 2 or 3 newspapers and Time magazine. And I think growing up in a house where people read and where there's books is a very, very important thing. And people are still reading, not in the numbers they used to. I remember at the library, people leaving, checking out a shopping bag full of books. And there would be a line at the checkout counter with Mrs. Munkowitz going as fast as she could.
My backyard is the Munkowitz's, Chris.
Oh, she was terrific. She was there. Every time I ever went to the library, Mrs. Munkowitz was there. And, but people still read. There's nothing like reading. It really is the best thing you can do. So if you come from a household, I think, where you've been blessed to live in a world of books and reading and dinner time discussions of world events and great works of art, you're really blessed. And so I was blessed to come from a family where we were all a little nutty in our own ways, but there was books everywhere, and there was talk of great events and works of art at the dinner table. I think those types of things really are things that are so important in life. And libraries, I can't say enough good things about the Sable Library and how much it meant to me growing up. And actually, the hours I spent at the Sable Library I remember riding my bike there and putting it in the bike rack, and there would be 8 or 10 other bikes there and no locks. You never worried about getting somebody stealing your bike. You could go into the library and read all afternoon in the corner someplace. What could be better than that? So I'm a blessed human being to not only come from a family of books, but from a town where books were everywhere too. The library, the bookstore with Elwell Smith, and before that, the Dwelly family, which owned the bookstore. We were a town, every town back then seemed to have a little bookshop, but Sable had 2 for a while. Nothing like a good book.
Chris, one was the bookcase. What was the other bookstore?
Runaway Bay. Well, they weren't open at the same time.
But Runaway, that's Mary Ann Bastian is the president of the library board, Chris.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I forgot that.
Okay.
Um,
Chris, you talk, I'm a little more serious than my last comment. You talk about Sayville community and growing up in Sayville. Do you want to speak a little bit to your experience at the Shoreham? Not the bar, the beach club when you were 10, 11, 12, okay?
The Shoreham was a beach club, and we were very blessed to be members of it. It was a private club, but anybody could join, really, for a fee. But it was nothing like swimming in the bay. There was a boardwalk that went way out into the bay, and we would spend every day of our lives in the summer down at the Shoreham, ride our bikes, never lock the bikes up. You had for your annual fee, you had a cabana and a hot dog stand for a luncheonette and a boardwalk to take you out into the bay. It was so much fun. And all of us who did go to the Shoreham were people who had nothing but safe, clean, good times. And between the Shoreham and Wet Pants, which was another unique Sayville institution, we were all blessed to be citizens of Sayville. Wet Pants, which to this day does a training program for handicapped kids and teaches sailing to anybody who comes down for a few bucks. Where else can you get that? So I don't know if we know how well off we have it in a world that's very dangerous and sometimes seems to be disintegrating. Sayville still goes on. Sayville Library goes on stronger than ever. And believe me, I made a right choice by not moving to Connecticut. Happy to be here.
I have a question. For somebody who grew up here, moved away for 40 years and came back, I have not lived through the transition. What changes do you see in Sayville from when we were growing up, even though you are older than I am? By a few years. From then to now.
It's funny, I think one of the things I noticed about Sayville is that not much changes. Which is some of the good thing about it is that it really is kind of timeless apple door, you know. I think a lot has stayed the same. Main Street, solid people. I see kids riding bikes down the sidewalk like I did 60 years ago. I guess technology has changed some things, and there's not as many kids. I don't see kids after school playing baseball in backyards. Kids after school go home and play on the computer, I guess.
Yeah.
But
No, I'm going to put a question. Can you guys see it? It's a picture of the Shoreham.
Let's see, it's a little slow on my end. I see that it says that you've started screen sharing, James, but I don't see the picture yet.
Yeah, it's the same here,
Can't see it
James.
either.
All right, so
It's-
I'll make one more attempt and then I won't hold people up.
Okay,
You can
now
see
it's your desktop.
Can you see it?
Just, we're looking at your desktop right
I
now.
forget it. Pardon the interruption, excuse me. It was a picture, Tommy, to your question of the Shoreham. It was a picture of the dining that was at the Shoreham, but I don't want to take away from other people asking questions. Others, please, Chris's friends.
I'd like to ask a question. Mr. Bodkin, you had a lot of success doing various things for the community that have made it better. Do you have any projects that you failed at, and particularly any that you would like other people to take up and see if they could make them happen for the betterment of the community?
Uh, I'm sure there were things I failed at. And I just can't think right now. If I had more time, I could have done some other things. I'd like to have seen Browns River get dredged again. I used to work hard at getting that done.
We're working on it, Chris. There's a group of us lobbying. It's the last time it was done, we're going on 13 years. So that's front and center. We just asked one of the council members. We're not backing off on it. It needs to happen.
It's something that's very important. And I used to know the congressman better, Peter King and Steve Israel and others, and we could get it done. So I know it's hard now because it's expensive and a lot of people don't really understand what it is, but it's very, very necessary. But as to the question, I'm trying to think of something I wish I had more time to accomplish.
Chris, you had talked about wanting to open up the pond on Brook Street again.
Oh, I did, yeah. When we were in high school, the pond on Brook Street was completely open. One sad thing I see going on that could be done is the vistas around all the lakes, like the San Souci Lakes and Bayport, is all disappearing behind trees and vegetation. And that's in a few years, all the mill pond, for example, is not going to be able to be seen from the highway. And the pond, Brook Street was allowed to grow over. I wish I had time to do that, open that up, because it was a beautiful pond. It is a beautiful pond. To show you how the world has changed. For gym class once back in 1962 or 3, the pond froze and we had gym class. We brought our ice skates and skated on the pond. Can you imagine? We used to walk home for lunch when I was at Green Avenue Elementary School. But the gym class was held on the pond with our own ice skates. Now I think the school is more on lockdown. You can't go anywhere for lunch but there. Anyway, I babble,
But you know what, Chris, you don't, because it's funny. Save the Great South Bay is a group that's committed to saving the bay. And we have 3 creeks in Sable. We have Greens Creek, and then Browns River is fed by 2 streams. One is Mill Pond and the other is San Souci. We don't have garbage in there. A lot of creeks, that's where they're at in terms of their creek defenders. And the thinking behind it is if you clean the creeks, the fresh water that feeds the bay will help.
Yeah.
So in Sable, we're past picking up garbage. We're now in the point of removing invasives. And we did our first pilot this past spring, and it was San Souci. And it was just 20, 25 people, but the plan in April is to go in, if we can get 100 people, it's to get rid of the bittersweet and the ivy that's choking all the trees in the creek, because they're going to take those trees down. So we want to free those trees, save those trees, which will help restore the bay. So your dream, we're working on it. And to me, we will free up the view, and also we will improve those creeks because we have to save the bay.
exactly.
It's our future, you know?
It is. And if you can do something to save the mill pond, it's going to disappear as you drive into Sable, from Bayport. It was on the left was the mill pond, on the right was the railroad tracks, but there was a stream that ran under the railroad bridge in there. And the San Souci Lakes, none of which you can see. used to be able to see them. And I think it's really important to be able to see lakes and ponds and streams. It's part of the quality of life that we have around here, and they've been allowed to grow trees, bushes, and shrubs around them, and they're disappearing everywhere throughout the county. So it's a sad thing to see that.
I want to welcome other people to please, definitely, if you can unmute yourself, ask Chris.
I have a question for Chris. My name is Bill Johnson. I am the nephew to Carl Johnson, the one that the street is named after. Chris, on behalf of the family, we are so grateful for what you have done. And every year we all meet at the monument when they do the service. And we'll continue as long as we can. Thank you, Chris.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Carl was a great American and was forgotten about. And I was happy in some small way, shape, or form to have his legacy remembered. And Florence Evans, poor Florence, what she went through is really extraordinary. She, as I said, she was just behind the lines for a year. And so some of the worst fighting, and came upon and saw and dealt with some of the toughest injuries to look at and be part of. And she really was totally forgotten. And I remember flipping through the yearbook of combat fatalities and seeing this woman going, what could her story possibly be? And the more I got into it, the more interesting it became. But beyond that, with her sacrifice and what she gave for the country was really amazing. So, and Merrill Mason, on and on. They had all been forgotten about, really. So I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to be able to do something about it. I wish I had another hour to tell the story about Carl working at Posy Wang's and all that. It's a wonderful story. Somebody could, like Steven Spielberg, could make a movie of Carl Johnson and Florence Evans and not have to make any of it up because it was all true and all heroic.
Well, Bill, thank you. I didn't make the connection. I didn't realize Bill was on this call. Thank you for that question.
No problem. And we all still have the original pamphlets that Chris had printed, which was courtesy of Grumman at the time. We still have about 25 of them that he handed out at the memorial.
Oh, boy. Actually, I'd love to have one.
We will get you a copy.
I live at 29 West Avenue.
Okay. We'll get it over to you.
It was,
Chris, you also did some work putting together a little history of folks who gave their lives during the Vietnam era. Could you speak to that?
I did. The Vietnam veterans' names didn't appear in Sparrow Park. And they were all friends, contemporaries of mine, people I grew up with in town, Spencer Lund and Mike Gibbons, and there was 5 or 6 others.
Kaiser.
Bernie Geyser, yeah. And anyway, that day, we added their names to the stones at Sparrow Park because they had never been put there. I don't know why. I mean, it costs not much in the way of money to have done. But I was able to put together a booklet for that too, which was really copies of which are here in the library about the men who gave their lives in Vietnam. A tough war, nothing like World War II. But people will miss forever. They were, again, for some reason forgotten. And I was happy to put their names. Mike Evans, I used to have lunch with every day
Hmm.
at Sable High School. He died very close to the end of the war
Hmm.
as well. But it's the least I could have done. I managed not to go to Vietnam somehow. And the least I could do was, in some way, shape, or form, remember the guys who had to go and didn't come back. Sable has quite a list of,
We do. Chris, I don't know if I mentioned you before, but John St. Lawrence, longtime officer for the Legion, discovered his uncle. They don't maintain local records always for veterans. And John was upset that his uncle wasn't being honored. So him and his wife, Carol Ann, they live on your street. You probably know them, but they documented and verified every veteran that is interred at St. Anne's in Union Cemetery. And the Legion put a medallion on each of their gravestones so that they be recognized. Because what he felt for getting a veteran, he couldn't let that happen to anybody. And they spent years, documenting and verifying so that they could be honored.
I was saying before that I always encourage people when they travel to visit the American cemeteries in the countries that they're in. They're huge. In England, I was driving by Cambridge and there was a sign that said the American cemetery this way. So I stopped and went into it. When I walked into the grounds, there was almost as far as the eye could see, American war dead. When you looked at the stones, they were all 18, 19, 20 years old. There was thousands of them. And that was just one cemetery in Europe. And on the continent, in Belgium and France, other countries, there's also American cemeteries that people don't visit. I always make the point, whenever you go on vacation, try to stop in an American cemetery just for an hour and walk among the stones. I know the Australians and the New Zealanders do it. Whenever they come to Europe, they always make a point to stop at the Australian and New Zealand cemeteries and just walk among the stones. You can't believe the size of the American cemeteries in France. They're just thousands of acres of kids and nobody there. They're beautifully kept. Anyway, every time I ever spoke on Memorial Day, I always would put in a plug for people to spend or go every time any of you ever went to Hawaii. There's a cemetery in Hawaii of World War II dead, Pearl Harbor dead. That's huge. So anyway, it's a good thing that they mark the cemeteries, the graves of combat fatalities, and that's one thing I wish I had more time to do. Other veterans, other combat fatalities, I didn't have time to recognize. I wish I had. So anyway, there it is.
Well, Chris, I have to say that I am one of those people that was on the other side of the checkout counter working with Georgie Monkowitz. So I spent several years working with Georgie here at the library. And so you brought back many good memories for me when you mentioned Georgie. And thank you so much for the way that, for honestly, the commercial that you have just given Save a Library in this interview, and the wonderful compliments that you have paid us. And I'm so glad that this place has been a treasure for you in life. It certainly has been for me too. That's one of the reasons that I'm here. And I'm just amazed at the history lesson that you gave us going through Sable, and the amount of contributions that you have made to make sure that we remember the history that has built our community, and those that have served and made significant contributions to our life here together. Thank you so much for making sure that they have not been forgotten, and that our community remembers them. So it has been a pleasure listening to you. Go ahead, were you going to add something?
Hemingway wrote a short story that was entitled A Clean, Well-Lit Place, in which he made the point that everybody needs a clean, well-lit place to go to in their life. And certainly the Sable Library has been that for me, a clean, well-lit place that was safe and where books just glow in the dark. Just wonderful. It was always a great refuge for me, and many, many, many others too have gotten such a good deal out of life by their contact with their local library. And
Chris, I can't begin to say thank you for all you've done for us, but I wanted to give, if there were any other questions, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but please, feel welcome. If you had any other questions. Yeah, thank you. My mom just gave you applause. We chose a couple stories, in the questions. To me, I think you follow your heart, and you've done that. But I think, to me, what struck me is, I think your personal integrity, Chris, and to live that out through your acts. It's not something that we see enough of. And I think that's one of the things that we struggle with as a society is we don't see that kind of leadership enough. So what you've done for us, teaching us about respect through the monuments, respecting the purest form of democracy. Like, what does it mean to be a citizen? You're what it means to be a citizen, and I think if we could do half of what you did in your life, I think that the world would be a better place. So I can't begin to say thank you for what you've done for us, and for being here and being you. Jonathan, I wanted to, please, if you, any, some thoughts, maybe some closing thoughts.
Just that I'm sitting here in awe with tons of notes that I have been feverishly writing as you have been discussing all of the contributions that you have made, and talking about your personal journey as you've led us as a community here in Sable. And just wanted to say thank you for that. I have James and I have had conversations about those ponds that you make note of. And I'm just so thrilled that I here I am, just a small person on the side working at the library, and I'm noticing things that somebody so great in our community, such as Chris Bodkin, has noticed and cared for. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking care of our community the way you have, and the wonderful member of our town of Sable that you are, and the contributions that you have made to build us up and to take care of us over time.
Yeah.
well, thank you.
That is,
It's for me to thank you at the library, because the library has been such a clean, well-lit place. And it's really provided refuge for so many people in so many different ways. And I think the thing we all can take away from the example of a good library is to encourage people to read. It really is, there's nothing quite like it. and the world of books is still there despite computers and Zoom and everything else. The world of books is unchanged. And we really, really should encourage particularly young people to read.
Absolutely. And well said. Well said on behalf of the library, Chris.
You bet.
Thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
oh, you're all welcome. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
We love you.
Love you, Judy.
Great job, Chris.
And Ginny, love you, Ginny.
Back at you.
And thank all of you.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye, Chris.
Take care.
Chris, thank
Good
you for
night.
a marvelous community interview this evening. And once again, for the mountain of contributions that you have made to our life together as a community. And that is what goes into making this the town that we have so loved over the years and continue to love. It's examples like you that keep our town as a place that so many people desire to live in. It's your efforts that bring us here to the way we are today. Thank you so much for
Thank
a
you. Good night,
marvelous
all.
interview.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Chris.
Good night.
Joining us, everyone.
Good
Thank
night.
Chris.
Thank you. Chris,
Yeah.
thank you very much for this. Is a great interview. I really appreciate your time. And Jonathan, thank you always, of course. But awesome. Really, really enjoyed the time, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you,
all
Chris.
of you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Good night.